Howdy, all you delicious people. I just wanted to come on here because I thought that this was going to be a really easy review. I ended up seeing this movie and it was like an hour and a small amount of change. So when looking at it, I'm like, you know what? How about I just review this movie? Because it'll probably be easy to do. So, reasonably, I honestly don't like this Justice League Dark animated movie, but I think reasonably with DC, I just don't think that they honestly actually care about Justice League Dark. Reasonably, when looking at it, I thought it was hilarious that, like, this movie is just kind of like a hodgepodge of, like, a mixture of things, and then also they have to forcibly give you origin stories of characters that you probably don't know exist or have never heard of them before. But then they double down on another Justice League Dark movie that isn't even Justice League Dark. It basically is just like Justice League with some sprinkling ins of every single member of the Justice League Dark. And it doesn't, like, it's not 100% like a Justice League Dark Ash like villain. It's just the normal sets up of stuff going on. I did a whole review about it. I'm sure it'll go out eventually. More than likely, I will probably have to upload that onto this channel because that is technically a Justice League Dark movie, which isn't really quite Justice League Dark enough, but you have all the members in the movie, so that's, I guess, where it counts. So more than likely, I'll have to upload that onto here, and then have these both be on here because they're technically Justice League Dark movies. So going into this, like, this doesn't even come off as an adaptation to the Justice League Dark comic books. Like, it kind of pretty much takes its own liberties because if this would have been a Justice League Dark story, we would have had Enchantress in here, but instead we just have these hodgepodge of villains and stuff like that going on here. We have a story that just kind of is just feels very just like, hey, like, it really, like, if this was Justice League, the story would be great, but since it's Justice League Dark, it just needs to be a thing. Basically, this story kind of feels very much reminiscent. If you watch, like, Constantine City of Demons, it feels like if this movie was a prerequisite to that, like, that movie kind of feels like a copy and paste of this film. Um, like, it feels like this movie was a rough draft to a better film, or like this movie was just like, well, we have to do all of this stuff in this film to get us to maybe a better point somewhere. But we have too many villains in this movie, no one cohesive story going on because forcibly we have to also break into origin stories, which immediately just, like, put a downside to things. Basically, the way that we introduce characters is not all that original, especially Zatanna. It's like, God, we have to introduce Zatanna. Like, we have, like, it seems like we've reused this scene, I don't know how many millions of times, where ultimately Santana is always doing the exact same intro every single time you've ever seen her in a show. This is how they open her up at her being in the show. It's no different than any other time. Um, we have we have ultimately Deadman Boston Brand who's in this, which I was like, yeah, like, I'm really excited to see this character and to see him get used. And ultimately, I think he's quasi the comic relief in here. It doesn't really feel that anybody's really getting a real true like moment in the sun within this movie, because you would think like if Constantine is probably the leader of Justice League Dark, he would be getting some time in the sun. But if anything, it might feel much more like Batman heavy. And I don't know, it doesn't really feel like there's a clear leader in Justice League Dark. It just feels like a bunch of hodgepodge people being forcibly having to do some case. Like there's no like it just is so odd. It's so much of an odd approach. We eventually, I think, if anything, we get more connections in Constantine's world more than anything else, to where um, we have to showcase his floating home, which ultimately in the Constantine show they kind of really tapped into. And but ultimately in this animated thing we get to see that it's like that he has a very much flying house that ultimately has a portion of the house that ends up creating its own entity for itself to help people, which I just thought was interesting. So anyways, we go into this movie and we have to tell origin stories, of course, about Deadman, and then ultimately we are also going to have to tell an origin story about Etrigan. If anything, the opening of this movie was kind of interesting. Like, we'll give them credit for that. But then anything to follow up after that was just like, God, just a mixed bag of just not quite good enough, if not quite that intriguing enough to where I'm like, yeah, I need to keep my eyes glued to what's going on. If anything, it's kind of interesting that eventually, once they get to the hospital-ish like stuff, as some kind of visual funny things going on, but then anything in between that is just bringing the hodgepodge. So yeah, we have nothing that clearly seems like it's adapted from anything. If anything, there might be very small amounts of things that are really adapted, but then everything feels like just randomly tossed together in no real true cohesion. And then it's like, okay, well, we sold another book. All right, let's get out of here. That's what this movie feels like. So at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to spoiling this movie and let's break it down into spoilers. Let's count it down. Let's get on our way to say spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of this, we have a bunch of people who are all seeing demons to the point where they're rushing to Superman's and Wonder Woman's and Batman's trying to say, "Oh, somebody please help me." Because everyone's seeing villains to the point to where a woman is holding on to her baby and she thinks that her baby is a demon. I thought that these were kind of interesting, cool openings, and it's just kind of interesting. Excuse me, for everyone to start seeing demons everywhere, and the demons are actually normal people, but people are just under a magical spell to see what is not actually really there. So the Justice League is compiling together and they're like, yeah, we've had these crazy cases, and so now like we need to figure out like some kind of like people that are able to deal with this kind of thing, because yeah, like there are some characters that deal with magic, like even Shazam has some kind of layer of magic going on, but like we need to figure out where this issue was coming from. So Bruce is kind of taking a shower, shaving, and ultimately a mirror has told him to go to Constantine. So Zatanna ultimately supposedly knows where Constantine is, so Batman is going to Zatanna to find Constantine. So we have it to where Batman goes to a performance that Zatanna is doing, and so at the very end of said performance, because usually every single time you have to have Zatanna being showcased in the background of some performance and being like having to be questioned by things and this and that. But anyway, so we have it to where ultimately our main character Constantine is ultimately playing in the very beginning of this. We have an opening sequence to where kind of tapering back, um, where Constantine is playing cards with the Demons 3. Ultimately, the demons were cheating, and Constantine wasn't pulling the rug over their eyes. So ultimately, then Constantine, towards the end of this, because he wants to win everything, he eventually cheats, and ultimately the demon gets mad because he's like, well, hey, like, you cheated, and Constantine's like, well, so did you, but you just held it better. So eventually Constantine gets a fight with the Demons 3 and ultimately seeks and forces Etrigan out of Jason Blood to fight the Demons 3 and kill them all. So ultimately, eventually, at some point in time, we're going to get an origin story of Etrigan and this and that. So eventually within this movie, Boston Brand is with Batman, and Zatanna is telling Batman the origin of Deadman. So yeah, we eventually get that story. So ultimately, we don't get a real origin story, really and truly, with Constantine. He's just like, hey, he's here now, and he's here, so might as well be happy about that. So So Constantine has to forcibly go to Richie to get some key. Richie is an old friend of Constantine, and usually Richie is a guy to usually go to for Constantine to usually get information. But Zatanna is trying to tell John, it's like, well, hey, there's something you don't know about Richie right now. And we find out that Richie is almost near death's door. And so ultimately, Richie talks with Constantine to try to get this key, and ultimately Richie the entire time is talking about how great it is to be in the same room as Batman. So that's kind of where Richie is kind of more open to kind of helping them out, is because he's right next to Batman. So we find out slowly but surely, like, Richie's really getting much more horrible in health. Uh, because what ends up happening is that when they are there to see Richie, Richie is incapacitated, and ultimately Batman has to give him an adrenaline shot to wake him or get him back from seemingly near death. So that's where they can kind of pump him for information and want to get his key. John chases after Jason Blood and then ultimately asks him, like, okay, hey, like why were you right on the top of Richie's body? And Jason confesses, like, dude, I'm going to tell you the whole entire truth. Like, ultimately what happened was, like, I had found Richie. He had seemingly been near dead, And so ultimately I ran because I know full well that you guys would accuse me of wanting to kill Richie, which there was none of the case of that. Like, I just came here for the same thing that you guys are coming here for. And so reasonably, Etrigan and John just kind of team up. So eventually, the whole crux is for them to eventually get this key and eventually them to realize that supposedly the villain that they are after is Felix Faust. So recently it ends up that Constantine is pushing to want to be with Swamp Thing, and ultimately, like, Constantine is asking if Swamp Thing would help them out, and ultimately Swamp Thing wants nothing to do with his team because it has nothing to do with the green. So, like, Constantine played his hand, but it didn't work out. So ultimately, we have the Justice League Dark all eventually going to Felix Faust. Batman seems to be kind of outwitted because most of his gadgets can't really do a lick of anything. So recently, we get it to where a lot of these characters are all using their powers against Felix Faust. The only problem is when Satana goes to fight Felix Faust, she can't talk because ultimately Felix Faust had taken her voice away from her via some magic spell, to where when she enters into this environment, no woman can talk, and she is a woman, of course. But eventually, we find that Zatanna ends up overpowering Felix Faust, clearly to the point of having her use extreme magic to just blow through Felix Faust. Because what ends up happening is that they end up having to, once finding these people who had been very much seeing demons, Constantine ends up going to their hospital and trying to put medallions on them to try and go into their brains to figure out like what had happened. Trying to get a flashback reference of what all they're like, trying to figure out what they're actually fighting. So they Zatanna and John, like, and Constantine uh go into a patient, a hospital patient, to figure out who their monster is of the week. And so then eventually there ends up being an explosion of some toilet where there is some big giant poop monster that ends up attacking the hospital, and then ends up having to take down, or seemingly try to take down Justice League Dark, but it doesn't work that way. Of course, the heroes end up taking him down because this is kind of tapering back from early part of this review. So now, pushing back to Felix Faust, we have it to where clearly it seems that they realize that Felix Faust doesn't really seem like the real and true legitimate culprit, but we find out that it's not really Felix Faust, it's Richie. Richie seems to have been playing on a lot of people's heartstrings, and he ultimately wants to uh, figure out a way to extend his stay to live longer. And so people are like trying to figure that out, how to like help him. So we have it to where Richie eventually is confessing that he's like, you know what, like, there were actually a couple different times where I actually was near death, but reasonably there are a lot of hemming up that I've done kind of much more recently. And we find out that reasonably Richie ends up putting this kind of magical element together that ultimately someone else was trying to steal. And so ultimately we find that that Richie had this medallion to make him a much more seemingly substantial threat, ultimately being the Doctor Destiny, which ultimately he has this like shield around him. And funny enough, once we would get it to where a lot of the Justice League, like John Stewart, Green Lantern, Superman, Wonder Woman, would come in there, ultimately they would be incapacitated by Doctor Destiny, to where ultimately they are fighting against the Justice League. So there are some cool moments of Justice League Dark having to take down the Justice League, but then eventually it comes down to where ultimately John ultimately just out magics the Doctor Destiny. Like basically he dismantles him, and like because what he ends up doing is he ends up uh forcibly getting Swamp Thing into the fight by burning some of the forest. And then also Constantine ends up using magic to get someone into Dr. Destiny's ball, and so that way ultimately Etrigan like tries to attack Dr. Destiny, but then we have it to where Dr. Destiny separates Jason Blood from Etrigan, and then so Doctor or uh, Jason Blood ends up dying because what had ended up happening in his past story when he was with Merlin and fighting Knights of the Round Table and fighting his villain at that portion of time. Ultimately, we find out that that Jason Blood had been stabbed, and ultimately he had to be fused with the demon Etrigan to keep him alive. Well, when Etrigan and Jason Blood were separated, it got to the point where Jason Blood was no longer immortal, and so ultimately that same stab that ultimately he had been fined from before is now back again and is now going to kill him. To ultimately Etrigan is just his own character now. So, but we have to ultimately they end up killing off. Uh, they end up killing off Doctor Destiny by releasing a thing inside of Doctor Destiny's like little ball shield and taking him out, and that's how eventually they just kill him off. So everything at the all of this, that everything at the all of this, and everything at the end of this ends up getting cleared up. Basically, uh, Richie, who kind of just went into business for himself, it's like, yeah, you know what? Like, nobody trusts you. But ultimately, it seems like they had enough resources to be able to bounce back from all of this. And so, yeah, like, that is really just the end of this review. Ultimately, there's a lot of hodgepodge things going on, and there's a lot of villains, and they shouldn't be. But yeah, not uh, a lot of care really being put into this adaptation. There's not much of a real trust being put into the Justice League Dark. It's just kind of like, okay, let's put this individual character, let's put this team in there, but it's not going to be good enough compared to probably the stories of the book, because it just kind of feels like a random addition that doesn't quite make any clear cut sense. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Yeah, I just want to quick mention. Yeah, the quick addition that they add in is basically, or at the end of all this, is like John Constantine ends up fighting with Doctor Destiny, and it ends up that um, Boston Brand ends up going into phasing into Doctor Destiny and doing a lot of like inner control work, and so that's what really ends up taking down Doctor Destiny is just his own self. And so yeah, it ends up the Doctor Destiny ends up separating Jason Blood from Etrigan, and then eventually like Deadman is kind of also um, kind of taken care of as well. So yeah, kind of interesting things going on here, but I think that's all I wanted to get into. That's all I wanted to say. And at the end of the day, hopefully this might have been detailed enough for some people, but I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.